Mr. President, first I ask unanimous consent that my defense fellow Dustin Mondlock be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the 117th Congress.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent that the following interns from my office be granted floor privileges for today's session. Mateus Voltolini, Timothy Ryan, Haley Smith, and Coulter Adams.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. I want to talk about essentially three big issues: the importance of the bill, what's in the bill, and the cost of the bill. The first question is, and when I used to appear before the Maine legislature, the first question always was, why are you here? What's the problem? Why is this bill so important? It's important because the essence of our defense policy since World War II has been deterrence. And deterrence means maintaining the capacity to inflict unacceptable costs on any potential adversary and the will to impose those costs if necessary. What we're really talking about in the Defense Authorization Act is the capacity. That is, what is it that we have at our disposal that can impose costs on our potential adversaries such that they will refrain from aggression and initiating a conflict which in this day and age would be catastrophic. Why do we have a defense bill? Why do we have a defense establishment? Why do we have ships and airplanes and space capability? In order to deter possible aggression. Why is this important? I'm just finishing a book by William L. Shirer called The Collapse of the Third Republic. Everyone knows Shirer's great book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. This was a subsequent book that he wrote in the late 60s about the French Republic and the relationship between France and England to Germany in the early days leading up to World War II. The central message, or one of the central messages of the book, was that the failure of France and Germany to deter and meet the aggression of Hitler early in the period leading up to World War II, as early as 1936, led to the conflagration of World War II. I would urge anyone who questions this assumption to Google Rhineland, 1936. Sudetenland, 1938. Those were places where Hitler could have been stopped with not an enormous expenditure or an enormous investment of troops or materiel, but by almost token resistance from the Western European powers that they utterly failed to do. And then we had the rearmament of the Rhineland, the takeover of the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and of course, in September of 1939, the invasion of Poland, leading to World War II, where 55 million people were lost. Shirer makes the point, and most historians make the point, that this was avoidable. Had Hitler been confronted early, before he'd completely rebuilt the Nazi war machine, World War II could have been avoided, and all of those losses, tremendous losses in this country and around the world, would have never happened. Deterrence is also a key to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons haven't been used in a confrontation or a conflict since 1945. Why? Because of the concept of deterrence, that those other countries, and there are other countries that have nuclear weapons, which have them, realize that if they are used, they will pay an enormous and unacceptable price. That has been the policy of this country for over 70 years, and it's worked. And it's worked. But it only works as long as the adversary believes that we do, in fact, have the capacity to inflict that kind of punishment. Deterrence is a matter of credibility, and you have to have a credible deterrent in terms of the actual capacity, and you also have to be credible in terms of your will to use it. And indeed, at this point in our history, we're talking about deterring the potential use of nuclear weapons in regard to the Ukraine conflict by Vladimir Putin. Deterrence means that capacity has to be credible, and the problem is here in this country, we have allowed our nuclear deterrent to deteriorate and age to the point where we're having to, in effect, rebuild it, not from scratch, but rebuild it substantially, all at the same time, the triad: bombers, missiles, submarines. We have to rebuild them, and it's happening at the same time, and it's expensive. And it's because this work was deferred for the prior 25 or 30 years that we're now having to do all three legs of the triad at one time, which adds substantially to the defense budget, but it's necessary in order to maintain the deterrent that keeps the peace. I have many friends in Maine who come up to me and say, why are we spending so much? Why are we doing nuclear weapons? Let's get rid of them. The problem is aggression and evil exist in the world. Always has, as far as we can see, always will. And the best war is the one that doesn't happen. And the most likely way to prevent war is for the potential adversary to know that the costs imposed upon them will be unacceptable. People also come up to me and say, why are we providing this money to Ukraine? I don't get a lot of this, but occasionally people say, why send money to Ukraine? We need that money here at home. That's when I always say, Google Rhineland 1936, Sudetenland 1938. Because Putin has told us who he is. He's told us that he feels the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. Ukraine is the first piece. I don't think there's any doubt that if he was allowed to just march in and take over Ukraine in a matter of weeks without any significant resistance, the next irritant for him would be the Baltics, and then Hungary, Moldova, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Maya Angelou says, if someone tells you who they are, you should believe them. He has told us who he is. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. That's why Ukraine is so important. That's why what we have done and what we have provided and the leadership this administration in our country has provided to other countries in the world in order to resist that aggression is so important and critical to avoiding a worse, much worse conflagration involving all of our countries down the road. That's why it's so important. When a dictator takes property, they're going to keep going. And that's why what we've done in Ukraine has been so critical and important. Well, Putin has told us what he wants to do, and we have joined with the rest of the world and the incredibly brave and resourceful people of Ukraine to stop him. That has to be continued. I'm going to talk about cost in a few minutes, but one quick note on cost is the only thing more expensive than maintaining a credible deterrent is war. Occasionally you see a bumper sticker that says, you cannot prepare for war and avoid war at the same time. I believe that is absolutely wrong. The only way to avoid war is to be prepared. And World War II, history is full of examples that that's the case, that aggressors look for weakness. They look for an opening. If they find none, they're going to pull back. And that's the entire theory of our defense posture and the expenditures that we're making on behalf of the defense of this country and the free world. So what's in the bill? It's a long bill, there's a lot in it, but a couple of highlights. First, there's a raise for the troops. There's more money for the people that are defending our country, which they deserve. In a time of inflation, they deserve a significant raise, and that's in the bill. Another piece that's in the bill that I think is very important in terms of our veterans, and of course we're just coming out of the Veterans Day observance last weekend, is funding and attention in the Defense Department to the transition from active duty service to veteran status. I believe that we should be spending as much, or the Defense Department should be spending as much time, money, and effort on the transition out of the service as they spend on recruiting to bring people into the service. The data is that the tragedy of suicide among our veterans is most acute in the first 2 or 3 years after separation. And that tells me that that's where we should focus some additional attention, and in fact, that's in this bill. There's an enormous commitment to technology in this bill, to artificial intelligence, to quantum computing, to hypersonics, to cyber, which is the sort of front line of the potential for aggression that's going on right now. There's a low-level cyber war going on right now. Ask any business in America. I talked to a utility executive recently whose company is being attacked 3 million times a day. Sometimes by state actors, sometimes by ordinary criminals for ransomware. But cyber is one of the most serious challenges we face, and again, that's addressed in this bill. Another thing that's addressed, as I mentioned, is upgrading the nuclear triad. Not because we like building submarines or missiles, but because we have to have a credible deterrent so that those, particularly those dictators in North Korea or other countries that have nuclear weapons, not be tempted to use them. They have to know that the price to be paid is unacceptable. There's counter-drug policy in the bill. All of that, all of those things are an important part of what this bill does for the country. I want to digress for a moment on process. This bill is a prime example of the bipartisan process that ought to govern all of our proceedings here in this body and in the other body. And indeed, over the last year, that's been the norm. 5 of the 6 major bills passed in the last year in this body have been bipartisan. And that's the way it ought to be, and that's the way it is in the Armed Services Committee. This bill was reported out of the Armed Services Committee, I can't remember, it was 25-1 or 23-3, but it was vast bipartisan support. I keep a little running tally in the Armed Services Committee when it comes to amendments. And this year, we had 433 amendments proposed going into the markup of the Defense Authorization Act. They were negotiated, they were withdrawn, they were modified, but we ended up with 44 amendment votes. 6 were on a party line basis. 6 out of 44 were on a party line basis. All the rest were bipartisan, either voice votes or roll call votes that were bipartisan. That's the way this process works, and that's the way this bill has come to this body. Now, let me talk a minute about cost. You often hear, and I hear it sometimes at home, sometimes down here, we spend more on defense than the next 10 countries in the world combined. Yes, but no other country in the world has the global responsibility that we have. No other country in the world has the global role that we have, that has to look in all directions, not just one direction to one neighbor, but in all directions. We have an enormous responsibility, whether we like it or not, as the most powerful country in the free world. And that means we have to support and defend freedom, democracy, the values that we have based this country on. We have to be the first line of defense. So the fact that we spend more than other countries, I don't think that's really the question. I think the real question should be, how much are we spending with regard to our overall economy and our federal budget? I think that's a fair question. And the answer is pretty surprising to many people. This is the percentage of national defense of federal spending, of total federal spending, going back to 1952, 70 years ago. In 1952, during the Korean War, and by the way, it was even higher during World War II, but 1952, about 70% of the federal budget was for defense. As you can see, it trends down through the 50s and 60s and 70s. In 1987, it was 28% of the federal budget. Today, it's 13%. It's at the lowest level it's been in 70 years as a percentage of the federal budget. I think that surprises most people. They think all we're doing is spending money on defense. As a percentage of the federal budget, it's actually the lowest it's been in 70 years. The other way to look at this, that I think is perhaps even more important, is the percentage of national defense spending of GDP, of our gross domestic product. That's really a fair measure. In other words, what part of our economy is devoted to defense spending? Again, going back to 1952, it was around 14%. 14% of our gross national product was spent on defense. 1987, 6%. Today, 3%. So people that argue that we're spending way too much on defense and why do you spend, they're looking at the raw dollars, but they really ought to be looking at how big a part of our economy are we devoting to defending this country and the freedom and values of the rest of the free world. 3%. Now, should other countries be paying a reasonable share? Absolutely. And many of them are stepping up. We're seeing significant increases in defense expenditures on behalf of many of our NATO allies and other countries around the world because they realize they have a responsibility too. But I think this is really an enlightening way to look at this in terms of what does this bill really mean? How expensive is it? The answer to that question is it's half as expensive as it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and it's about 20% of where it was 70 years ago. Is it a lot of money? Absolutely. The question is, what's it for? What's it for is preventing war. As I think I said earlier, the only thing more expensive than maintaining an adequate deterrence is war itself. And that's what this bill is all about. We have passed the National Defense Authorization Act every year for the past 62 years. I deeply hope and believe in the interests of this country, of our citizens, and of the entire free world. We're going to do so again in the next month. Mr. President, there's no more solemn responsibility we have to go back to the first words of the Constitution in order to provide for the common defense is one of the major functions. That's in the preamble. That's the overarching. Provide for the common defense, ensure domestic tranquility. Those are part of the essential function of any government. It's our responsibility. I deeply hope in the next several weeks in this body we will meet that responsibility. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.